Peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon you, and welcome to all our dear followers everywhere. The Greatest Secret channel, under the supervision and management of the writer and author, Mr. Mohammad Salim Al-Kazimi, Al-Maqdisi, is pleased to welcome you to this renewed encounter and to announce the launch of the new and highly anticipated season of the legendary debate between the atheist and the Muslim. This season comes to unveil the most prominent intellectual issue of our time, which revolves around the dilemma of atheism in denying the unseen world.
From an audio article to the grand debate. This intellectual discourse began as an audio article in 3 international languages, Arabic, English, and German, authored by the channel's director, Mr. Mohammad Al-Kazimi. You can always access it via the link in the description box below this video on the Greatest Secret YouTube channel. Given the significant and remarkable interest this topic has garnered, and the exceptional engagement and numerous insightful comments and contributions we have received, especially from our German and English-speaking followers, the channel's management has decided to transform these discussions and scholarly responses into a visual and audio format. These responses have been structured as a legendary debate, spanning several episodes, totaling over 10 hours of philosophical and scientific research and analysis.
Why is it an exceptional debate? Contemporary and sensitive topics. The episodes address issues that touch upon the very essence of human existence and speak directly to the human mind in our present time. Comprehensive approach. This is a global debate that excludes no one, opening the doors of thought to every thoughtful seeker of truth on this planet.
Share your opinions with us. We hope you enjoy this engaging and intellectually stimulating program. We at the channel's management encourage anyone with a comment, viewpoint, or contribution to share it with us in the comments section. We are open to hearing your opinions and are fully prepared to discuss them politely, objectively, and with mutual respect. Be there, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Muslims said, if the text has more than one valid interpretation, you say any interpretation other than mine is a distortion of the text.
Atheist reply. It wasn't just my interpretation. It was how everyone interpreted it until it was proven wrong. It's a plain reading of the text. It's taking the words on the page to mean what they say. No one in Islamic circles expected to find the universe to be expanding. Not until after it was discovered to be so. Until then, those verses were thought to describe it as spread out, or made vast, and so on. So, again, if everyone reading a text reads it one way, that's not my interpretation, that's everyone's interpretation. At that point, we got into the bat piss. Can I come up with a way in which that isn't an insult? Sure. But if I myself don't explain that to you, why would you ever decide to interpret it as something else except to save your idea that I'm not insulting you?
The Muslim response. I can respond here by clarifying that the historical prevalence of a particular interpretation does not necessarily make it the only linguistically possible interpretation, and that understanding texts sometimes evolves with new discoveries or knowledge, and this does not necessarily mean distortion. Or I can respond like this. The problem is that you equate the common interpretation in a certain period with the only meaning allowed by the text. These are 2 different things. Just because most people understood a word in a certain way at one time does not mean that the language does not carry another meaning supported by its rules and context. Many human texts have been re-understood as knowledge has developed, without this meaning that all previous understanding was a deception or that the new understanding is a distortion. Then the example of the expansion of the universe is not settled by simply saying no one understood that way. The question is, does the word in its language and context bear this meaning or not? Are there clues within the text or in the language that support it? This is the subject of debate. As for your comparison to an insulting phrase, there is an important difference. In everyday communication, the speaker's intention is an essential element because the addressee is present and can explain. As for historical texts, we do not have the author in front of us, so we use the tools to understand the text. language, context, style, and historical use of words. If we applied your principle to all texts, every subsequent reinterpretation of any historical text would have to be considered a distortion, and this does not happen in law, philosophy, or science. Sometimes we discover that a certain meaning was broader than the first readers thought. So the issue is not, can I invent an explanation that exonerates the text? Rather, does this interpretation have a linguistic and contextual basis or not? There is a short answer. The popular explanation is not always the only explanation. The history of ideas is full of texts that have been re-understood after new knowledge has emerged. The criterion is not, who said it first? Rather, is the new meaning consistent with the language and context, or is it imposed on the text? The important point here, I am not defending any interpretation simply because it is possible. Rather, I focus on the fact that the possibility of multiple meanings in language is a well-known fact, and that proving distortion requires proving that the new meaning is not tolerated by the language at all. Muslims said, and if a valid linguistic and contextual interpretation exists.
Atheist reply. Please show that it is, in fact, valid. That is, that your preferred reading is valid. Not because it matches reality, but because the reading itself is a valid one. On what basis do you say, without pointing to reality that we know now, that it's a valid reading?
The Muslim response. I can clarify that the validity of a linguistic interpretation is not measured solely by its conformity with subsequent external information, but rather by the methodology used to interpret the text itself, as is the case with any historical document. The response would then be, the validity of a linguistic interpretation does not mean that I choose the reading that I like or that agrees with a preconceived conclusion, but rather that it meets the same criteria for understanding the text. We judge an interpretation based on factors such as the meaning of words in the language and time period of the text, a grammar and morphology, the context of the verse or passage, the use of the term in the rest of the text, the consistency of the meaning with the overall structure of the discourse. These criteria do not depend on prior knowledge of the scientific conclusion. For example, when a historian interprets an ancient letter, they do not need to know all future events to determine the meaning of the words used by the writer. They infer from the language, the context, and the available evidence. As for your statement, it is proven correct because it corresponds to current reality. This is not what we are saying. There is a difference between 1. The validity of understanding the text from a linguistic perspective. 2. The accuracy of the information the text refers to in reality. An interpretation may be linguistically correct, and then the discussion arises, is what the text says about reality true or not? Therefore, we don't need to assume a scientific conclusion to understand language. Rather, we need a linguistic approach first, and then compare the extracted meaning with reality. My concise answer is, the accuracy of an interpretation is not derived solely from its conformity with a recent discovery, but also from the rules of grammar and context. After determining the meaning of the text, we can discuss its correspondence with reality. Otherwise, understanding any ancient text becomes impossible, because we would judge it only through our current knowledge. The key point here is, as an atheist, you're trying to make external reality the sole tool for determining the meaning of the text, while in reality, there are two separate stages. First, understanding the text, and then evaluating its relationship to reality. Muslims said, the crux of your objection here is, what cannot be empirically tested cannot be justified.
Atheist reply. Not exactly. It's that, what cannot be empirically tested cannot be justified as true about external reality.
The Muslim response. Your response here is more precise than the previous formulation, but you are still adopting an epistemological principle that needs justification. You are not providing proof for it, but rather stating it as a general rule. Here, I can respond like this. You now adopt the following principle: no claim about external reality can be justified unless it is empirically testable. The question is, what is the evidence for the validity of this principle itself? The repeated failure through history of finding out we were wrong when we didn't operate in this way. Muslims said, this principle is not the result of a scientific experiment, nor can it be empirically tested, because it is a cognitive rule that defines what constitutes evidence, not a claim about a natural phenomenon. Therefore, it is a philosophical position, not an empirical fact.
Atheist reply. Do Do you think that how we think about stuff is somehow external to our own minds? I'm struggling here to process this. I specifically implied a delineation between internal thought and external reality. Empiricism is how we decide the external is correct, but it isn't needed for the internal. The idea that this is true is, itself, internal because it's in our minds but is not a reality itself. It isn't out there, it has no effect on what reality is like or does or how it operates, merely on how we think about it. If your God ideas are purely internal, then I have no problem in pursuing them in that fashion, but at that point you end up admitting your God isn't actually real, doesn't actually do anything, just as thoughts and ways we think about things don't actually do anything either.
The Muslim response. I can respond by clarifying that, as an atheist, you are confusing the nature of the idea in the mind with the object of the idea. The fact that the idea of God exists in the mind does not mean that God is merely an idea, just as the idea of gravity in the mind does not mean that gravity does not exist outside the mind. The response then becomes, there is a confusion between two different things, the existence of the idea in the mind and the existence of the thing to which the idea refers. All our knowledge begins within the mind. We only access external reality through perception and thought. However, the fact that our knowledge of something is mental does not mean that the object of knowledge is solely mental. For example, the idea of the sun in my mind is a mental state, but this does not mean that the sun is merely an idea and has no existence outside the mind. Similarly, the idea of gravity within the mind does not make gravity something internal with no effect on reality. Therefore, when we say that a philosophical principle concerns how to evaluate evidence, this does not mean that it is merely an idea unrelated to reality, but rather that it is a mental tool we use to judge claims related to reality. As for God, the question is not, does the idea of God exist in our minds? This is clear. Rather, the question is, does this idea have a real referent outside the mind? This is the issue at hand. Furthermore, your assertion that experience is the only way to determine what is external is itself not the result of external experience, but rather a philosophical judgment about the limits of knowledge. That is, you are using a philosophical principle to determine what you accept from philosophy. Therefore, it is not enough to say, this is an internal idea, because all our knowledge begins as internal ideas. The real question is, do these ideas correspond to something outside the mind? My concise response is, the existence of an idea in T. Human mind does not make its object merely an idea. The idea of the sun is within the mind, but the sun is not within the mind. Similarly, the claim that experience is the criterion for knowing reality is itself a philosophical principle that cannot be proven by experience. The crucial point here is that I am not directly defending the existence of God at this stage. Rather, I am emphasizing that your argument as an atheist about inside and outside applies to all human knowledge, not just religion. Muslims said, furthermore, we accept many propositions concerning external reality based on rational inference, not direct experimentation, such as the existence of other people's minds, the reliability of memory, the regularity of nature, and the truth of logical reasoning.
Atheist reply. The truth of logical reasoning is internal, not external. It's something about how we think about things. Minds are a description of a certain sort of behavior. This is why many people thought ChatGPT had a mind. It doesn't. Memory reliability. Tell me you've never studied the reliability of memory without saying you've never studied the reliability of memory. Human memory sucks. Every time you remember something, you aren't pulling up some detailed recording. You're taking a few scattered sense impressions and recreating a narrative out of it. Over time, your memory is liable to change because of this, with some sense impressions getting stronger or weaker and thus affecting the narrative we construct out of them, which then further strengthens and weakens sense impressions. This is part of why we started writing things down, then recording in other ways, to get around the immense fallibility of human memory, which evolved to solve issues of survival and social cohesion, not to store accurate information for all time.
The Muslim response. I could respond here by clarifying that, as an atheist, you are not addressing the core of the problem, but rather shifting to criticizing the tools of knowledge themselves. However, this criticism does not negate their use, because human knowledge is not based on absolute certainty, but rather on degrees of justification. Or I could respond like this. You are confusing something being not absolutely certain with it being unreliable. It is true that human memory is not perfect, and that perception can be flawed, but this does not mean that we have no justification for trusting it. In fact, our awareness of the limitations of memory itself comes from using memory, reason, and the methodologies upon which they are based. You cannot use a tool of knowledge to prove that it is entirely worthless. As for your statement that reason and logic are internal, this does not answer the question. The issue is not whether logical thinking occurs within our brains, that is obvious, but rather, do the rules of logic reflect anything about reality, or are they merely mental patterns unrelated to it? If the laws of logic are merely evolutionary illusions useful for survival, another question arises. Why do we trust them when we use them to arrive at truths about the universe? Why does mathematics, an abstract mental construct, succeed in describing external reality with such astonishing accuracy? Furthermore, your assertion that the mind evolved for survival, not for truth, does not undermine its reliability, because survival often requires a degree of connection to reality. An organism that constantly misinterprets its environment will not survive for long. As for the existence of other people's minds, it is not merely an observation of behavior. It is an inference based on the best interpretation. We do not see mind itself even in others, but rather infer it from actions, speech, and consciousness similar to our own. Therefore, the debate is not about the existence of errors in the tools of knowledge, that is a given, but rather about the question, are these tools reliable enough to know reality? And if the answer is yes in science and everyday life, then we cannot dismiss their use when they lead to philosophical conclusions simply because they do not provide absolute certainty. My concise and powerful response is this: the fact that memory and the mind are fallible does not mean they are unreliable. We are not seeking absolute certainty, but sufficient justification. Paradoxically, denying the reliability of the mind by using the mind itself undermines the very tool upon which that denial rests. The crucial point of this response is that I am not trying to prove that the mind is infallible, because that is incorrect. The better approach is to demonstrate that science itself relies on a mind, memory, and logic that science cannot empirically prove without first employing them. Muslims said, "Your response involves an unjustified inductive leap. You go from many untested ideas have been wrong to therefore every idea that cannot be empirically tested is unjustified. This doesn't logically follow."
Atheist reply. Is inductive reasoning logical? Yes. So going from many examples to a general principle, which is all that science ever does, is also logical.
The Muslim response. I can respond by clarifying that the problem isn't with induction itself, but rather with the legitimacy and scope of a generalization. Induction is a cognitive tool, but it only yields absolute conclusions if the premises are suitable for the conclusion. And here's how I can respond. It's true that induction is a rational method for constructing knowledge, and science relies on it, but the problem isn't with using induction, but with jumping from a limited scope to a sweeping judgment. Science doesn't say, since some untested hypotheses have failed, then everything untested is unjustified. Rather, it says, we evaluate each hypothesis according to its nature and the evidence related to it. For example, the failure of old, untested medical theories doesn't mean that every untested hypothesis in physics, mathematics, or philosophy is worthless. Nor does it mean that the principles upon which science itself is based should be rejected because they aren't direct experimental results. Furthermore, your induction needs additional justification. Why do you move from some untested claims were false to the lack of testing makes the claim unreasonable or improbable? This isn't an empirical observation, but a philosophical principle about knowledge. Even science itself doesn't operate on this principle. Many theories began as unproven hypotheses and gained rational weight before testing because of their explanatory power and consistency with existing knowledge. So induction says, be wary of unsupported claims, not, no idea has value before empirical testing. My shorter answer is, induction is legitimate, but its success depends on generalizations being of the same nature and circumstances. You can't go from some untested ideas fail to everything that isn't empirically tested is unjustified, because that's a generalization broader than the evidence it's based on. The crucial philosophical point here is, as an atheist, you use induction to justify a principle, but you need to explain why that principle applies to all kinds of issues, not just empirical hypotheses about natural phenomena. Muslims said, your conclusion that every claim that isn't empirically testable is unjustified doesn't come from this observation alone, It requires an additional philosophical principle.
Atheist reply. Yes, it's called induction. That's how inductive logic works. Indeed, your observation itself relies on non-empirical assumptions, such as that the past is a valid basis for inferring the future, that induction is justifiable, and that reason can deduce general rules from particular cases. These are not experimental findings. Scientific principles, indeed epistemological principles upon which science itself is based. Furthermore, the absence of empirical testing is not a sufficient reason for error. There is a difference between 1. An idea that has not yet been tested. 2. An idea that is not empirically testable. 3. An idea that has been proven false. Correct. And my stance is that an idea about external reality, that is, things that are not just about how we think on stuff, that has not been tested and/or is not testable is one that we have no good reason to accept.
The Muslim response. I could reply by explaining that as an atheist, you've moved from a partially valid principle, the importance of testing, to a broader and proven one that empirical testing is a prerequisite for all knowledge of reality, and that you're using non-empirical epistemological principles and then making exceptions for them. Or I could respond like this. The problem isn't accepting induction, but rather how it's used and what it's entitled to conclude. Yes, induction is an important tool in science, but it doesn't say, anything that hasn't been empirically tested has no basis for acceptance. This is a philosophical addition that goes beyond what induction itself offers. Induction relies on a deeper principle, that the past resembles the future, that nature is orderly, and that our minds are capable of discovering these orderly patterns. These principles aren't the results of past experiences, but rather conditions that make experience and science possible in the first place. Herein lies the problem. You accept non-empirical principles when they serve the construction of science, then reject the possibility of any non-empirical principles when they relate to other philosophical questions. Furthermore, there's a difference between I don't have sufficient evidence to accept a particular idea. Oh, there is no rational justification for accepting it. The first is a cautious and acceptable stance, while the second is a claim that requires proof. For example, the existence of other minds, the existence of the external world, or the fact that natural laws will continue tomorrow as they do today are not propositions directly proven by experience. Yet, we do not consider them mere speculation because they are supported by rational arguments. Therefore, the criterion is not, has the idea been subjected to laboratory testing, but rather, what kind of evidence is appropriate to the nature of this idea. Empirical propositions are tested by experiment. Logical propositions by their consistency, and metaphysical propositions by their ability to explain the totality of data and their consistency with established knowledge. A shorter response is, induction does not prove that everything not empirically testable is without justification. Rather, it justifies relative confidence in certain patterns of reality. However, turning it into a rule, I do not accept anything that is not empirically testable, is a non-empirical philosophical principle that itself requires justification. The strongest point here is that as an atheist you are not just defending science, but a particular scientific philosophy, strict empiricism, and this philosophy itself is not the result of scientific experimentation. Muslims said, is your conclusion the absence of empirical testing leads to error, itself the result of a scientific experiment, or is it an inductive generalization from previous examples?
Atheist reply. Scientific testing is not the only form of empiricism. But if you want to set one up, just go through the past ideas we've had and whether they later turned out to be wrong or not when they were not based on observation/testing of some sort. The hypothesis is that those that were not based on such observations, it will be much more likely to be wrong, and if it is based on such observations, it will be more likely to be right. You will be able to find this out quite easily to be the case. Which is why, as science does, we go with the inductive reasoning principle that non-empirical, observation and testing, results are to be treated with great skepticism and not accepted, which is not the same as declaring them false, until such time as the empiricism part kicks in.
The Muslim response. I could explain that, as an atheist, you've shifted your stance from everything untested is unjustifiable to we doubt it, a more moderate position. However, you still need to justify making this a general rule for all types of knowledge. Here, I can respond. You've moved to a different, more specific position. Not that everything untested is wrong, but that it deserves a lower degree of trust. This is acceptable as a precautionary measure in many empirical matters. But the question remains, why make this rule all-encompassing for all matters related to reality? Science itself doesn't rely solely on direct observation. It depends on principles that don't originate from laboratory experiment, such as, a nature is orderly. The senses and reason can be trusted to a certain extent. The past can provide information about the future. Mathematical laws describe external reality. These principles aren't the results of past experiments. They are prerequisites for using experimentation in the first place. Furthermore, your statement that ideas not based on observation have often been wrong requires specifying what kind of ideas we are talking about. The historical failure of alchemy or natural myths does not prove that every non-empirical philosophical question lacks justification. For example, the question of the existence of other minds is not logical and cannot be tested in the same way we test a chemical substance, yet we have rational reasons to accept it. Similarly, the principles of logic are not discovered through laboratory experimentation. Rather, we use them to judge the validity of the experiments themselves. So the question is not, do we need evidence? Yes, we do. But the disagreement is, what constitutes evidence? And must all evidence be of the empirical type? If we make experience the sole criterion, we are not deducing from experience, but rather adopting a philosophical stance about the limits of knowledge. My short answer is induction justifies caution regarding unsupported claims, but it does not prove that empirical testing is the only path to all knowledge. Even science is based on non-empirical principles that it uses before conducting any experiment. The strength of this response is that I do not reject the scientific method, but rather I show that the real disagreement is about the limits of its application and not about its value within its field. Muslims said, your response seems strong because you discussed the examples one by one, but you haven't answered the original point. Instead, you've digressed into side discussions.
Atheist reply. Then provide better examples. Not my fault if your examples do not show what you claim. You claim that we accept propositions as reasonable without them being testable. Then you gave a list. I showed each one was not the case, that either we don't think it's reasonable, or that we've tested it. So if you are going to continue to push this point, it is your obligation to provide an example of a proposition that is generally accepted without it being testable.
The Muslim response. I can respond here by pointing out that, as an atheist, you've shifted the discussion from the nature of rational justification to a single request for example, while the issue is much deeper. Is empirical testing the sole condition for plausibility? Furthermore, some of the examples you mentioned don't resolve the issue in the way you claim. The response then becomes, the problem is that you presuppose that plausibility means that which is proven by direct experience, and then use this definition to prove the same conclusion. My point is not that every untestable idea should be accepted, but rather that there are propositions we consider rational and justified even though they aren't based on direct experience. For example, the principle of causality, the regularity of nature, the existence of other people's minds, and the validity of logical reasoning are not the results of individual experiments, but rather principles we use to interpret the experiments themselves. When you say, we have tested them, the question is, how did you test that induction itself is justified? How did you test that the future will resemble the past? How did you test that the human mind is even capable of reaching the truth? These aren't the results of experiments, but rather principles that precede experience. Your assertion that every example must be generally acceptable changes the question. Many philosophical issues are not resolved by consensus, but that doesn't make them irrational. The history of thought itself is built upon discussions of issues that were not empirically testable, yet were still the subject of reasoning. So the goal isn't to provide an idea universally accepted without testing, but rather to demonstrate that empirical testing is the only possible criterion for justification, and this claim itself cannot be empirically proven. My shorter response is, you're asking for an example of a non-empirical proposition, then rejecting any example because it's not empirical. But that's precisely the point of contention. The question isn't, is experience important? It's, is it the sole source of all justified knowledge? This claim is philosophical, not empirical. An important point, I'm not framing the discussion as a defense of specific examples only, because the atheist here will continue to attack every example. So it's always best to return to the general principle. Is experience a prerequisite for all types of knowledge or not? Muslims said, I didn't say that memory is infallible, or that we understand the entire universe, or that we can experimentally prove the existence of other minds. My question was, on what basis are these beliefs justified in the first place?
Atheist reply. On what basis are what beliefs justified? That we have memory. Empirical results where we test memory. That we can experimentally show that things likely do or don't have minds. Empirical results where we test for possession of a mind.
The Muslim response. I could reply by explaining that, as an atheist, you assume that justification can only be achieved in the way one desires, while the question concerns the prerequisites that precede the experiment and make the experiment itself possible. Then I could respond like this. The problem is that you assume justification is only possible if we have direct empirical testing of the thing itself, but this is a criterion that cannot even be applied to the science you advocate. When you conduct a memory experiment, you presuppose that your senses provide you with sufficiently accurate information, that the measuring device is functioning reliably, that your memory of the experiment's results is not an illusion, that the logical rules you use to analyze the results are correct. These are not things that the experiment proves from scratch. Rather, they are conditions that make the experiment possible in the first place. As for the existence of other people's minds, we don't test mind itself as we would test matter in a laboratory. Instead, we infer its existence from the best interpretation of the data, behavior, language, and consciousness similar to what we know about ourselves. Denying this inference will lead to doubting the existence of any mind other than your own. So the question isn't, do we have an experiment that proves these things in the same way we prove a physical phenomenon? But rather, do we have sufficient rational reasons to accept them? Science itself doesn't operate solely on direct evidence. It relies on inferences and premises that cannot be derived from experience without prior assumption. A concise answer is this: experience doesn't justify itself. It presupposes trust in the senses, reason, logic, and memory. Therefore, experience cannot be the sole criterion of knowledge, because it depends on principles that haven't been empirically proven before being used. The main point here is, I'm not denying the importance of EXP, variance, but rather showing that it's not the absolute starting point. It operates within a broader framework of knowledge. Muslims said, you infer their existence from behavior, but you don't observe the mind itself, you infer it.
Atheist reply. So, science, then. Inference from observation is not accepted until that inference is tested. We test the inference of mind. It was done with ChatGPT, specifically, which is how we concluded it isn't one.
The Muslim response. I can counter by pointing out that, as an atheist, you are using the very reasoning you are trying to deny. You yourself don't observe mind in ChatGPT or in humans. Rather, you infer its presence or absence from behavior and rational criteria. Then I can respond like this. The problem is that you are confirming the point I am trying to make. We don't directly observe mind, but rather infer it from its effects. When you say that ChatGPT doesn't have a mind, you haven't opened inside the system and seen the absence of mind, but rather you have inferred it from certain characteristics of its behavior and operation. That is, you have used reasoning to reach the best explanation, not direct observation. The same applies to humans. We don't see consciousness or mind in others, but rather we infer it from speech, behavior, and similarities in structure and abilities. This type of reasoning isn't unique to religion or philosophy. It is a fundamental part of our understanding of the world. As for your statement, science tests this reasoning. This doesn't solve the problem. Because the test itself relies on presuppositions about the meaning of behavior and the difference between information processing and the existence of an internal conscious experience. Furthermore, your assertion that ChatGPT lacks a mind doesn't prove that inference from behavior is illegitimate. It merely demonstrates that some systems exhibiting mind-like behavior don't necessarily possess a mind. This is a crucial distinction. So the debate isn't whether we directly observe a mind. We don't. Rather, it's whether inferring an internal reality from outward signs is a legitimate inference. If you reject it, you must also reject the way you've determined the existence of other people's minds. My concise answer is, your assertion that ChatGPT lacks a mind isn't a result of directly observing the presence or absence of a mind, but rather an inference drawn from its behavior and modal. If operation. This is the same type of inference we use to establish the existence of other people's minds. The question isn't whether we infer a mind from behavior, but whether that inference is justified. The key point here is that, as an atheist, you can't rely solely on science in this matter. Because science itself relies on inferences about things that are not directly visible, such as minds, atoms, and abstract laws. Muslims said, challenging memory can only justify science if memory itself is reliable enough to allow science to exist.
Atheist reply. Which is something we test, by doing science and having science be more correct over time in a way in which it produces testable predictions.
The Muslim response. I could reply by explaining that the atheist here is describing how to improve the use of memory in science, but he doesn't answer the earlier philosophical question, what justifies the initial trust in the tool we use for testing? Or I could reply like this. But this doesn't answer the fundamental question. It presupposes it. When you say, we test memory through the practice of science, you're using memory, reason, and logic to judge the results of this test. That is, you haven't escaped the cycle of relying on these tools. Rather, you've used them to evaluate themselves. No one is saying that memory is infallible or that it doesn't need correction. On the contrary, science itself has developed methods to reduce memory errors, such as recording, documentation, repetition, and measurement. But all these methods presuppose a degree of trust in the senses, reason, and memory. Therefore, there is a difference between 1. Testing and improving a tool we trust to a certain degree. 2. Proving the validity of the tool from scratch without using it. Science does the first, not the second. And this isn't a problem with science. It's the nature of every knowledge system. Humans cannot start from scratch without any initial assumptions. The real question is not, are these tools certain, but rather, do we have sufficient rational grounds to trust them? The answer is that science itself is based on this initial trust, but it cannot prove it empirically without first assuming it. In short, testing memory scientifically does not prove the reliability of memory from scratch, because the test itself relies on memory, reason, and logic. Science refines the tools of knowledge, but it cannot establish them without first assuming them. The key point, I'm not trying to prove that memory is perfect, but rather to demonstrate that any cognitive approach requires pre-experimental premises, even the experimental method itself. Muslims said, logic cannot be used to prove logic without a certain degree of validity.
Atheist reply. Logic is the method we use to measure ideas. You can't measure the measuring stick itself, you just sort of use it. In this case that's fine because logic is internal, not external. We made it up in our heads based on what we observed of reality.
The Muslim response. I could respond here by pointing out that, as an atheist, you implicitly agree with a fundamental point. Logic cannot be justified by logic without a prior assumption of its validity. Furthermore, your description of logic as a mental invention conflates the discovery of rules with their creation. Or I could respond like this. Your statement that logic is the tool we use to measure ideas doesn't solve the problem. It only reinforces it. The question isn't, do we use logic? That's undisputed. The question is, why do we trust that logic reveals valid relationships between ideas and reality? When you say, the tool of measurement itself cannot be measured, you acknowledge that there are fundamental cognitive tools that cannot be proven by a deeper tool, but are accepted as a prerequisite for all proof. This applies to logic. As for your claim that logic is internal, and that we invented it from observations of reality, there's a difference between our discovery and understanding of logical formulations, of the fact that the principles of logic are merely a human invention. We didn't invent the idea that something cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. Rather, we discovered a principle related to the very nature of consistency. If logic were merely a mental construct, then the opposite could be true in another reality. But even the idea of another reality cannot be discussed except through logic. Furthermore, your claim that logic arises from observations of reality raises another question. How do you know that your observations of reality are correct and that your conclusions from them are correct? You will then have to resort to logic again. Therefore, logic is not simply a tool we invented, like a hammer, but rather the framework that makes thinking, reasoning, and judging the validity of any other tool possible. A shorter answer is this: your assertion that logic is a tool that cannot be measured by itself confirms that it is a principle prior to measurement. However, the claim that we invented it from reality does not answer. How do we know that our conclusions from reality are correct except by using logic itself? Logic is not merely a mental habit, but a prerequisite for the possibility of thinking about truth and falsehood. The main point: I'm not trying to prove that logic is something physical outside the mind. That is not the point of contention. Rather, I want to emphasize here that even those who say that logic is a mental invention cannot deny that every denial of it implicitly employs it. Muslims said, saying that we understand only a part of the universe does not negate the fact that scientific inquiry is based on the assumption that the universe has an order that the mind can discover.
Atheist reply. An assumption based on our having do so rather successfully at various times using observation and testing, but woefully deficiently when observation and testing were not in force. This is an internal idea, so doesn't need testing in itself.
The Muslim response. I could respond here by explaining that, as an atheist, you're confusing the discovery that order exists with a presupposition of a comprehensible and orderly structure that makes scientific discovery possible in the first place. Then I could respond like this. But this response presupposes the very point of discussion. When you say that we know the order of the universe based on the success of observation and experimentation, you are presupposing that the results of previous observations can reveal the true order, and that the laws we have discovered today will remain valid tomorrow. This is not the result of a single experiment, but rather a prior principle that makes experimentation meaningful. Furthermore, your claim that this is an internal idea does not solve the problem, because its content is not merely a human way of thinking, but claim about external reality, that the universe is ordered and comprehensible, not just a series of random, unrelated events. Science does not simply discover that some phenomena have patterns. It is based from the outset on the assumption that there is an orderly structure that the mind and mathematics can access. If the universe were changing without any order, there would be no science at all, no matter how many observations were made. Your claim that we failed when observation and testing were unavailable merely demonstrates the limitations of our knowledge, not that everything beyond direct testing is unjustified. Even the principle that observation and testing are the correct path to knowledge is not the result of laboratory experimentation, but rather a methodological principle we employ prior to experimentation. Therefore, the disagreement is not about the success of science, but about the very foundations that make the success of science possible in the first place. My concise response is, the success of science not only proves that some phenomena are observable, but also presupposes that the universe is ordered and that the mind is capable of discovering this order. This is not the result of experimentation, but a condition that makes experimentation and science possible. The crux of the matter here is that the atheist acknowledges this as a presupposition, but tries to absolve it of the need for justification because it is internal. The counterargument is that this presupposition speaks to the nature of external reality, not merely to a personal mode of thinking. Muslims said, the strongest response is to show that you separate the internal from the external in a way that itself requires justification and cannot be empirically proven.
Atheist reply. How is that a strong response? This delineation is, itself, internal, and thus doesn't require the empirical proving that external ideas require.
The Muslim response. I could counter that as an atheist. You treat the distinction between internal and external as a general epistemological principle, not merely a specific mental state, and therefore it requires justification. The problem is that you treat the distinction between internal and external as a settled matter, when in fact it is a philosophical principle that determines what needs proof and what is not. If you say, this idea is internal, therefore it doesn't need proof, you're no longer simply describing a mental state, but rather presenting a general rule of knowledge, that ideas about the way we think don't need external justification, while ideas about reality do. But this rule itself isn't just an internal experience. It's a claim about the relationship between the mind and reality, and about the limits of human knowledge. So why do we accept it? The problem arises when we move from we have an idea within our minds to this idea accurately describes reality. For example, saying experience is the standard for judging external reality isn't just a psychological state, but a rule that claims validity for all minds in all situations. Therefore, no one is asking you to prove every internal idea with a laboratory experiment. The question is, When does an internal belief become justifiable as a judgment of reality? Here, you need a criterion, and this criterion itself requires philosophical, not empirical justification. In short, describing an idea as internal is not enough to exempt it from justification when used to establish general rules about truth and knowledge. My concise answer: the mere existence of an idea in the mind does not automatically make it true or justifiable. You are not defending the mere existence of an internal idea, but rather a principle stating that some ideas do not require justification while others do. This principle itself is a philosophical position that needs to be explained. The crucial point I am in, OT arguing that the distinction between internal and external is wrong, but rather that its use as a criterion for knowledge transcends being simply a mental construct. Muslims said, "You say that philosophy is good for organizing our internal ideas, but it cannot justify any claim about external reality. The question is, how did you prove this rule?"
Atheist reply: via the internal methods of inductive reasoning, which is justifiable unless you think induction itself is not justifiable, in which case all of science goes away, including the science you're using to view this message.
The Muslim response: I could respond by explaining that, as an atheist, you are using induction here to prove the limitations of induction itself, and that you are confusing accepting induction as a practical tool with making it the sole criterion for all knowledge. But this doesn't answer the question. It merely rephrases the same principle. You say that you have proven that philosophy cannot justify any claim about external reality through inductive reasoning, but induction can tell us about the success of a particular method in past cases. It doesn't prove that this method is the only possible way to know reality. In other words, from observing that experience has been very successful in explaining natural phenomena, it doesn't logically follow that all knowledge about reality must be empirical, because this conclusion itself goes beyond what has been tested. Furthermore, your statement that rejecting induction leads to the collapse of science is partially true, but it doesn't solve the problem. The question isn't, should we use induction? Rather, what is the basis for justifying its use? Induction presupposes that nature is orderly, and that patterns of the past can help us understand the future. This isn't a result of previous induction. Otherwise, we would be in a circular argument. So no one rejects induction or science. The disagreement is that you take a particular epistemological principle, empiricism, and present it as a scientific conclusion, when in reality it is a philosophical stance on what constitutes evidence. Science needs these philosophical premises, but it cannot prove them with its own tools because it is inherently dependent on them. A shorter answer: induction justifies practical confidence in a method that has previously succeeded, but it does not prove that this method is the sole source of all knowledge. Your assertion that philosophy cannot justify any external reality is itself a philosophical judgment that cannot be derived from experience alone. My focus here is not on attacking induction, as this would weaken my argument, but rather on demonstrating that, as an atheist, you are using a valid epistemological tool within its proper scope and then extending it to a universal principle that itself requires philosophical justification. Muslims said, furthermore, science itself is not limited to direct observation.
Atheist reply: and I didn't say it had to be directly observable. I said it had to be testable. Direct observation is a form of testing, but not the only form of testing.
The Muslim response: I can reply by explaining that you are shifting the discussion from direct observation to testability, and that this doesn't resolve the issue, because the question is, are all matters related to external reality testable in the first place? And is testing the sole criterion for justification? Then I can respond as follows: your shift from direct observation to testability doesn't resolve the issue. Rather, it moves the question to a deeper level. Why must every fact about external reality be testable in order to be justified? Testability itself is not the result of an empirical test, but rather a methodological criterion we have established to judge certain types of claims. Furthermore, there is a difference between a scientific claim about a phenomenon that can be observed and measured, a philosophical claim concerning the foundations of the existence of these phenomena or the conditions under which we can know them. Science can test models of how the universe works, but it doesn't directly test questions such as, why does the universe exist? Why do there are regular, understandable laws? Is the human mind capable of knowing the truth? These are not scientific gaps, but rather questions that fall at a different level of analysis. Then you accept certain things that are not tested in the same way as physical phenomena, such as the validity of logic and induction and the existence of other people's minds, because you see them as justified in other ways. So the disagreement isn't about the importance of testing, but about reducing all forms of rational justification to empirical testing alone. This reduction itself is a philosophical position that needs justification. My concise answer is, testability is an important criterion within the empirical sciences, but the question is it the sole criterion for all knowledge about reality? This claim isn't the result of testing, but a philosophical position. And science itself relies on principles that aren't empirically tested in the same way. This formulation puts the debate in its proper perspective, not against science, but against transforming the scientific method into a comprehensive philosophy of all knowledge. Muslims said, science does not merely move from observation to observation, but from observation to inferences about an unobserved external reality.
Atheist reply. And then tests those inferences by trying to show they're wrong.
The Muslim response. I can counter that, as an atheist, you are implicitly acknowledging that science relies on reasoning that goes beyond direct observation, and that testing doesn't negate the role of logical deduction but rather presupposes it. This precisely confirms the point we are discussing. Science doesn't merely observe. It moves from observation to inferences about things not directly observed, and then tests these inferences. But the transition from observation to inference isn't observation itself. It's a process of logical deduction. For example, we don't see gravity directly, nor do we see electrons or black holes directly in many cases. Instead, we infer their existence from their effects, construct explanatory models, and then test their results. Therefore, testing doesn't negate reasoning. It depends on it. Before you can say, this hypothesis failed or succeeded in testing, you need a logical framework that connects observations to results, and you need to assume that reality is orderly and that tests provide us with information about an external truth. The issue isn't that science accepts any inference without testing, but rather that testing itself comes after a prior logical step, selecting a particular explanation as worthy of testing and relating the results to the hypothesis. Therefore, the question remains, what is the philosophical basis that legitimizes this type of reasoning? Science uses it, but its legitimacy is not derived from prior empirical experience. A concise answer is this: testing inferences does not negate the fact that science begins with deduction from the observed to the unobserved. Testing comes after reasoning, not in place of it. The question is, why do we trust in the first place that this mental transition from effect to cause reveals an external reality? With this answer, I'm not denying the scientific method, but rather demonstrating that the scientific method itself relies on preceding intellectual and philosophical tools. Muslims said, similarly, if a philosophical argument is presented for the existence of a first cause or creator, it is insufficient to reject it simply because it pertains to external reality. Its premises and the argument itself must be discussed.
Atheist reply. And so must its testing, of which you continue to provide none.
The Muslim response. I can respond by explaining that, as an atheist, you assume that all arguments must be subjected to the same kind of empirical testing, while this conflation of different fields is precisely the point of contention. But here you are assuming the very conclusion that needs to be proven, that you demand every argument about reality be subjected to empirical testing. A philosophical argument does not claim to be a laboratory experiment. Rather, it is a rational inference based on premises and an examination of the necessary connection between them and the conclusion. Therefore, its critique is achieved by examining the premises, logical consistency, and explanatory power, not necessarily through direct experimentation. For example, there is no experiment that tests the principle of non-contradiction or the validity of logical reasoning, yet we do not consider them to be without epistemic value. Similarly, we do not test the existence of the past or the existence of other people's minds in the same way we test a physical phenomenon, but we have rational reasons to accept them. If you, as an atheist, have a problem with the argument from first cause, then what is required is to point out which premise is false or which logical transition is incorrect, not simply to say, it has not been empirically tested, because your statement that anything that cannot be empirically tested is unacceptable is itself a philosophical position, not the result of empirical experimentation. My brief response is, not every question about reality is resolved by the same method. Experimentation tests empirical phenomena, while philosophical arguments are discussed using their own logic and premises. If the first argument is flawed, point out the flaw. Don't simply demand empirical testing of something that isn't within the realm of empirical issues. The key point: don't defend the validity of an argument before discussing it. Focus first on the fact that the criteria of empirical testing is not the sole criterion for all types of rationality. Muslims said, otherwise you have not invalidated the argument, but rather preemptively dismissed it based on the nature of the conclusion it reaches.
Atheist reply. It's not based on the nature of the conclusion, it's based on the methodology. You do not test your ideas about some external reality. As these ideas about external reality are not tested, it is that methodology which is, at the very least, not to be accepted unless and until the testing is done.
The Muslim response. I could argue that, as an atheist, you make empirical testing a prerequisite for accepting any methodology, but you only justify this condition by using a pre-tested rational method. But here we return to the very point of contention, that any methodology dealing with external reality is only acceptable if it is empirically testable. The question is, why is empirical testing the sole criterion for accepting methodologies? Empirical testing itself does not prove the validity of the rational reasoning we use to arrive at conclusions, nor does it prove that the transition from observations to inferences about external reality is legitimate. Rather, it presupposes logic, induction, trust in the senses, and reason. So when you say, this methodology is only acceptable after testing, you are presenting a general principle of knowledge. This principle is not the result of an experiment, but a philosophical judgment about how knowledge is attained. Furthermore, a philosophical argument does not claim to be a scientific experiment, but rather claims that certain premises, if true, logically lead to a specific conclusion. Therefore, it should be evaluated by examining the premises and logical connections, not rejected outright simply because it is not a laboratory experiment. The disagreement isn't about the importance of testing, but rather whether testing is the only path to all justified knowledge about reality. This question itself is philosophical. A concise response follows. You don't reject the argument because it fails, but because you've set a precondition. All knowledge about reality must be empirical. But this precondition isn't the result of experience. It's a philosophical position that needs justification. Therefore, the argument itself should be discussed, not dismissed before even considering it. With this response, the debate returns to the fundamental point, not whether science tests, but whether empirical testing is the sole criterion of rationality. Muslims said, if it is merely an internal rule, then it is not binding on others, nor can it be used to refute philosophical arguments concerning external reality.
Atheist reply. Well, first of all, no thinking, not even deductive logic, is binding on others. You like using it, but I'm in no way bound to care for your opinion. Beyond that, though, logic isn't real, it isn't out there. It's a way we, collectively, as a species, think about things. We've decided we like it because it seems to work rather well, in that when we follow those rules of thinking, we tend to generate ideas that are more likely to lead to outcomes we like, in the sense that we like our ideas to correspond to reality, than when we don't. Internal does not mean the same as individual.
The Muslim response. I can respond by explaining that, as an atheist, you confuse logic being a tool used by the mind with it being merely a human construct that can be changed, and that denying the objectivity of logic leads to a subjective problem in every argument. The problem is that you have moved from the fact that logic is used within the mind to saying that it is merely a human invention. These are two different things. The fact that we use logic does not mean that we created it as we create a language or an artificial tool. We discover its principles and try to formulate them, but we do not have the freedom to make a contradiction true or to make a proposition and its negation true simultaneously. Furthermore, your statement, there is no thought or logic that is binding on others, undermines your own argument. Because at this moment, you are presenting an argument that you want me to accept, and you assume that I must see that its premises lead to its conclusion. But if there is no shared logical obligation, there is no reason why your argument is better than its negation. As for your statement that logic is effective because it gives us the results we want, the question is, why are the results we want the correct results? Desire is one thing, and the correspondence of thought to reality is another. We don't consider logic valid because we like it, but because rejecting it renders the very discussion impossible. Even those who say logic isn't real use logical rules to make their statement understandable and meaningful. So the issue isn't that logic is external in the sense of existing as a physical entity outside the mind, but rather that it possesses a validity that transcends the whims of individuals and cultures. Otherwise, there would be no difference between proof and error, or between truth and illusion. My concise answer is, the fact that logic is practiced within the mind doesn't mean it's an arbitrary invention of the mind. Logical rules aren't merely human habits, because any attempt to deny them implicitly uses them. If logic lacked any shared obligation, then argument or proof would be meaningless. The strongest point here is that, as an atheist, you're trying to reduce logic to a mere useful tool, but the deeper question is, why should this tool be a revealer of truth and not simply a useful means of survival? This is a question that utility alone cannot answer. Muslims said, your response reveals an important point, but you assume that empirical testing is the only way to make a claim about external reality plausible.
Atheist reply. No, again. My position is not about plausibility, it's about whether it is reasonable to accept as true/close to true or whether we should reserve judgment and not accept the idea for now.
The Muslim response. I can respond by clarifying that you've changed the term from reasonableness to acceptability, and this doesn't alter the essence of the discussion because the question is, what justifies accepting a belief? Changing the terminology doesn't change the core issue. When you say, I won't accept an idea until it's tested, you're talking about a criterion for epistemological acceptance. That is a philosophical question. What makes a belief justifiable? I don't object to the principle of caution or demanding evidence. This is a rational principle. The disagreement lies in limiting acceptable evidence to empirical testing alone. Some propositions aren't accepted simply because they've been directly tested, but because they're supported by rational arguments. For example, the existence of other minds besides your own, or the validity of logical reasoning, the order of nature, of that the external world exists and isn't merely an illusion. These aren't propositions tested in the same way we test a chemical substance, yet we don't treat them as baseless ideas. So the question isn't, should we accept any idea without evidence? Certainly not. The question is, must all evidence be empirical? Here, you are presenting a philosophical position that needs justification, not merely a scientific conclusion. While caution and judgment is a legitimate stance, making it a general rule that excludes everything not subject to empirical testing is an additional claim that requires substantiation. A shorter response follows. Whether you call it reasonableness or acceptability, the question remains the same. What is the criterion for accepting a belief? If you say that empirical testing is the sole criterion, you are presenting a philosophical principle about knowledge, not the result of an empirical experiment. With this response, I'm not advocating for accepting any claim without evidence, but rather placing the debate in its proper context. Is experience the only form of evidence, or just one type of evidence? Muslims said. You also ask, what can we observe in reality that contradicts these things? As if empirical falsifiability were the sole criterion for plausibility, whereas this is a criterion specific to empirical science, not to all forms of reasoning.
Atheist reply. Again, I keep waiting for you to show examples where we generally accept an idea where falsifiability isn't even possible in principle. The rest of what you said fails to understand the distinction between internal and external. You think if we, as a species, have found a certain method of thinking to be useful, then that means it is external. But that's not the case, it's still internal even if most of us do it or try to do it. Philosophical reasoning is all internal. What makes something internal is whether or not the thing in itself has any effect without a mind. Logic has no effect without a mind. Thus logic is internal, not external. An atom will still do whatever it does whether there are any minds or not, so far as anyone can tell. Thus, atoms are external, not internal. Furthermore, your question, what can be observed in reality that contradicts these things, assumes that every reasonable claim must be empirically falsifiable. However, this is not a general criterion for knowledge, but rather a criterion used to evaluate many scientific hypotheses. Outside of the topic we disagree on, a creator of the universe, please provide an example. I continue to wait for one. Do you believe that every truth about external reality must be testable? Is it empirical? Or are there truths that can be known through rational deduction? The former. And the justification is the inference from prior results where we just used pure thought, deduction alone, to get to results. You may want to read Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. Pure reason alone is insufficient. It's mental masturbation. That's why we stopped using it.
The Muslim response. I can counter here that, as an atheist, you have broadened the definition of external to equate it with measurable material, which is precisely the point of contention. Furthermore, you demand an example of irrefutable propositions while simultaneously rejecting all philosophical examples. The problem is that you have defined the criterion for external as that which has a material effect independent of the mind. But this is a specific philosophical definition, not a self-evident truth. If by external you mean only physical things, then you have predetermined the conclusion. Anything that is not material cannot be external. But the question is, must everything that is real be material or empirically measurable? As for your assertion that logic is internal because it does not affect atoms, this conflates two different kinds of existence. Logical laws are not material things that exert influence like physical forces. Rather, they are conditions for the validity of thought and proof. The not being physical forces does not mean they are merely mental constructs. Furthermore, your statement that logic is useful because it gives us desired results does not explain why these results are true. There may be ways of thinking useful for survival, but they don't necessarily reflect reality. The question isn't, is logic useful? Rather, why does it correspond to reality? As for your request for an example of a truth that cannot be empirically refuted, there are many examples of issues we can't reach through direct experience, such as the existence of other people's minds, that the past actually happened, that the universe didn't exist a moment ago, with false memories implanted within us, the validity of the principle of causality or induction. We're not saying these issues are without evidence, but rather that their evidence isn't of the direct empirical type. Furthermore, your statement that pure reason alone is insufficient doesn't prove that reason is worthless. It simply proves that reason works in conjunction with other data. This is something both philosophy and science accept. Science itself isn't composed solely of observations, but also of concepts, inferences, and mathematical models that don't originate from experience alone. Therefore, the disagreement isn't between reason and experience, but between two positions. First, both experience and reason are sources of knowledge, each with its own domain. The second point is that experience is the sole source, and this is itself a philosophical position that cannot be proven empirically. My concise response is, you are not proving that every external truth must be testable. You are assuming this by defining external as that which is subject to physical measurement. But this is precisely the point of contention. Science itself uses non-empirical rational principles such as logic, induction, and mathematics. It cannot prove them using a tool that is